Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Tomas Morales Rebecki. I'm an organizer here in Ventura, California. And today I'm going to be talking to Oakley from the research team about a sneak peek into a new piece of research they've produced. The research is about why it's not enough to support renewables and what that means for our local campaigns, especially for communities like mine here in Ventura County, California, where we have over 3,000 active oil wells. We have hundreds of oil wells right next to homes, which are majority Latino communities, communities of color, just like my own community, where we live within a half mile of hundreds of oil wells. So we're going to talk about what we've learned and what we need to do to keep pushing for 100% renewable energy and stop the supply side. So I'd like to welcome Oakley. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So cool. We'll just get right into it. Our first question is, renewable energy is booming. Will that be enough to avert climate chaos that we are experiencing?
So, the rapid improvement of renewable energy technology is great news. And in combination with existing energy storage technologies, we're at the point where 100% of our electricity could come from truly clean sources like wind and solar. Over the past decade, we've moved from renewable energy shows immense promise, but it's expensive, to every part of this system that we need has been demonstrated at scale and at costs comparable to our current electricity system. That's a huge opportunity. But at the same time, it's important to remember that new sources of energy have not historically replaced old sources of energy. Rather, what tends to happen is that overall energy consumption just increases and the new joins the old rather than replacing it. That's what happened with nuclear, and it's at risk of happening with renewables right now. So, during the past decade, the proportion of electricity from renewable sources rose, and that's in large part due to successful political action and organizing. It's not just technological improvement. And it rose from about 3% to about 10% of electricity. The problem is that there's also been this huge increase in fossil fuel production over the same period. So during the last decade, natural gas grew from supplying 22.7% of electricity to supplying 39.3%. And in large part, that's because fracking has allowed massively expanded oil and gas production. Nearly 80% of natural gas produced in the United States now is from fracking. Fracking has also expanded technologically accessible and commercially viable reserves of fossil fuels. These new reserves put us in a dire place for averting climate chaos.
Yeah, exactly. We're experiencing that here in Ventura County. We made a big push over the years to get community choice energy, and thanks to that, a majority of the county is running on 100% clean renewable electricity. But still, we have over 25 million barrels of oil reserves that we know of that oil companies are still going to be tried sucking dry, and majority of that oil is not even used here in California or in the U.S. So we have this huge problem that we're getting there with electricity to renewables, but at the same time, we're not addressing the reserves that are in the ground, and we're not keeping that in the ground, which we need. So like here in California, in Ventura County, where it's a Democratic state, and Democratic state governments in places like Virginia and California have promoted the building of new renewable energy. Are pro-renewable policies enough to decarbonize our electricity system?
Yeah, no, that's a great example. And I think it's a great question. I think it's best framed by some historical context of this, like starting at the federal level. So the fracking boom really took off under the Obama presidency, which supported natural gas alongside renewable energy. Then the Trump administration championed what they termed the all of the above approach to the energy, essentially saying the more the merrier. So while Trump may have said some absurd things about wind power, behind the scenes, administration officials were actually pretty supportive of renewable development, just so long as it didn't threaten fossil fuel interests. And now what you see is that in democratically controlled states with nominally anti climate change governments, you actually see a lesser version of this same dynamic. It seems like it's much easier to promote renewable energy than it is to actually challenge the incumbent fossil fuel industry. And California is a great example of this statewide. California is the largest producer of solar power in the country. That's great. But it's also the seventh largest oil producer with the third largest refining industry. And that's behind Texas and Louisiana. So while California has taken some steps against oil production, these phase out plans with long time horizons could create a use it or lose it situation that can actually increase production in the short term. Another dangerous trend that we're seeing is the reluctance to close dirty power plants. What we've seen is that building renewable energy isn't even enough to get fossil fuel power plants shuttered. When Virginia passed a bill that required the addition of renewable energy, the state's major utility companies submitted a resource plan that didn't accelerate the retirement of their fossil fuel power plants compared to their plans without the legislation. This is a super dangerous dynamic because we know that there's often a thumb on the scale in favor of fossil fuel power plants compared to renewables when both are built. It should be really, really simple. Solar and wind cost almost nothing to operate, whereas thermal power plants have to pay for fuel. But we know there's a thumb on the scale because sometimes renewables get turned off or curtailed while dirty plants are still producing electricity.
Exactly. And yeah, talking about timelines that are not realistic. We've been fighting really hard to get a ban on fracking here in California, and thanks to a lot of our continuous pressure, we got Governor Newsom recently to announce that there will be a ban on fracking by 2024, and that's not soon enough, and a complete phase out of all oil production by 2045. And as you said, we're a major oil producer here in Ventura County too. We're the third largest oil producing county. So those timelines, it's going to be a race to dig up as much oil as they can in the meantime. And it doesn't really help us locally because we use many other enhanced oil recovery techniques, not just fracking, which are just as dangerous too, like acidizing and cyclic steam. And they can pollute our groundwater, cause earthquakes. So banning fracking by 2024 is a great gesture, but it doesn't do anything in reality for the rest of us and for the rest of the state. And it's really just like a race to the bottom of who can get that last dirty barrel of oil out. So a lot of the tension in climate change discourse is centered on removing dirty energy sources from the electricity supply. Why does Food and Water Watch think it's important to also target the production of fossil fuels?
Yeah, so this is super important. The way I see it, binding restrictions on the supply of fossil fuels are just an indispensable climate safety measure. I think perhaps the most important lesson that we should draw from the past 15 or so years is that we can't rely on either technological progress or on technological constraints to save us. So if you think back, like way back now, in the years preceding the Great Recession, there was this view among some that peak oil would, at a minimum, create some environmental guardrails. What the fracking boom did was expand massively the supply of cheaply accessible reserves of fossil fuels, enough that now a huge portion of coal, gas, and oil must not be extracted if we want to meet climate targets. The fracking boom also undermined many of the gains made by wind, and particularly solar, over that same time period, supporting the build-out of multi-decadal fossil fuel infrastructure at a time when we need to be moving to a completely clean energy system. And if that's not bad enough, the scary thing is that without political action, it could all happen again. Right now, there are hard to access fossil fuel reserves that, if made commercially viable, could double to triple oil and gas supplies. Even technological improvements that merely make the extraction of current fossil fuels cheaper, they could reduce costs to a point where they massively outcompete clean energy sources. This could even happen for coal. I think we might talk more about this later, but this is the reason that policies solely reliant on shifting market signals should keep us up at night. The other aspect of this is leakage. It's just not enough to target fossil fuels use at the point of consumption, because often these same fossil fuels just end up shunted into other uses. For example, only about 35% of natural gas is actually burned to produce electricity. And less use at power plants could just mean more industrial use at petrochemical plants that produce things like plastic, or it could mean it's exported. Now, exports are a particularly dangerous problem. Right now, operating, under construction, and permitted natural gas export capacity is sufficient to export about half of all gas produced in the United States. And that, if that's allowed to continue, this export capacity could completely offset the elimination of natural gas power plants.
Yeah, and we've had our fair share of power plant fights, especially fracked gas power plants here in our neighboring city of Oxnard, the biggest city in Ventura County, and over 70% Latino. They were trying to actually build a fourth gas-fired power plant on the coast, right near the beach, and it would make it the city with the most gas-fired power plants. But luckily, we were able to stop that, and we found alternatives. They did a battery storage project instead, one of the biggest in the state. So that was a great victory for us and our community in air and our electricity system. But we're still seeing the majority of the oil and gas and natural gas drilled here in Ventura isn't even used here in California because it's so dirty. Like I was saying, like it doesn't even meet our carbon fuel standards. So a lot of this is being used for either bunker fuel or asphalt. And we're really just polluting our communities to export it to other areas and use it for stuff that we're not even using in our electricity or even our cars. So yeah, as we see, it's like we're taking the brunt of the pollution here and exporting it to other markets. So why do market-based schemes like cap and trade or carbon taxes fall short of meeting the challenge posed by climate change?
Yeah. And I think that your examples from California really highlight this sort of dynamic. So if you look at restrictions on extraction, they tend to be very easy to implement, verify, and enforce. When oil and gas remain underground, they just aren't being burned anywhere. It takes them out of the climate change equation completely. Other supply side measures, like banning fossil fuel exports, would shut off the ability for the US to act as a global fossil fuel supplier. Unlike market incentives, these measures create certainty about climate outcomes, and they don't rely on the sort of vagaries of technological progress. But when extraction is allowed to continue and use is regulated through these complex market schemes, what often happens is that pollution is merely moved around out of country or out of state, or just among localities. And research shows that this process of shifting often tends to actually result in increased pollution for marginalized communities. With carbon taxes, there's a huge amount of modeling and conjecturing about how perfect they're supposed to be at reducing carbon emissions. But when you look at what happens when carbon taxes are actually enacted, it paints a very different picture. Even fairly high carbon taxes barely make a dent in carbon emissions. Carbon taxes aren't a real climate solution, but they're very regressive and they can have this legitimizing effect on pollution. So if you look at states with taxes on fossil fuels, which would operate very similarly to carbon taxes, it's a per unit tax, they end up addicted to the revenue that those taxes produce, and they have a very hard time making the switch away from fossil fuel dependence.
Exactly. And California is the perfect case study for that. We've had cap and trade going for a while. And while they were trying to renew it, a lot of studies came out showing that under cap and trade, pollution has actually increased and gotten worse in frontline communities and communities of color. That's why we call it pollution trading. So these false market solutions has a perfect case example in California how it's not working. And it's actually made air quality and pollution worse in communities of color, just like mine here in Ventura County, because drilling and refining continues in these areas and producers just buy offsets from other areas that do no real impact or have no real improving effect on the lives of people in communities like ours. So yeah, these false solutions are really things that we need to be weary of and fighting back strongly, because we don't usually see these consequences until it's too late. So thank you so much, Oakley. Any other last comments from the research or points you'd like to make?
I don't want to sound too pessimistic. I think we can win. I just think we need to confront the supply of fossil fuels in every instance, and the work people are doing at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level, it all makes a difference, and it's all really impactful.
Definitely. And that's what keeps me fighting every day. And I feel lucky to be part of an organization like Food and Water Watch. And that's why we're working for real solutions to provide 100% clean, renewable energy to everyone in the US. And we won't settle for these false solutions or unreal or unproven technologies that the fossil fuel industry or the latest think tank tries to promote. So we're doing this, like as we've shown today, from the local level to the national level, because we realize our entire future is at stake. And it's going to take everyone fighting like we live here to keep the pressure up and win real solutions. It's our only hope, and we are committed to that every day here at Food and Water Watch. And it's possible because of the continued support of people like you. So thank you all for joining here today, and keep the fight up. And we only got a couple years, and we really need to fight for the climate and the planet that we all deserve. Thank you.